The Hall of Resonance was built to make every living creature feel small, and it did its job well. It rose from the surface of Valeth Prime, like a cathedral, made of bone-white stone and living crystal, its walls humming with a low vibration that pressed against the chest of anyone who stepped inside, and the ceiling stretched so far above that clouds sometimes formed between the pillars, drifting lazily through shafts of pale golden light that poured from windows carved centuries before humanity ever looked up at the stars. The floor was the worst part. Every inch of it was carved with names, thousands upon thousands of names, written in scripts that no living mouth could speak anymore, because the species that had created those scripts were gone, erased from the galaxy so completely that only these carvings remained, and every ambassador who walked across that floor walked on the graves of civilizations that had once dared to say no. Ambassador Alara Mwangi walked across those names now, her boots clicking against the stone, and she kept her chin up, even though every instinct in her body screamed at her to look down, to read the names, to understand what they meant. She already understood. The galleries above were full, tiered rows of alien faces watching her approach the far end of the hall, where the throne sat on a raised platform of black glass, and every one of those faces belonged to a species that had knelt in this very room, that had surrendered its ships and its songs and its sovereignty in exchange for the privilege of continued existence under imperial rule. The Inari were there, tall insectoid beings with wings folded tight against their backs, like prisoners keeping their arms close, and they watched Alara with compound eyes that revealed nothing. The Druth were there too, massive reptilian figures squeezed into seats too small for their frames, their scarred hides a map of centuries of servitude. They watched her with something that might have been curiosity, or might have been hunger, or might have been hope. And on the throne sat Archon Sovereign Kael'thas Vendrathor. He was ancient in a way that had nothing to do with age, a tall and impossibly still figure wrapped in robes that seemed to shift between silver and shadow, depending on the angle of the light, and his face was smooth and pale and beautiful, in the way that a glacier is beautiful, cold and vast and utterly without mercy. He held out one hand, and a scroll of light materialized above his palm, glowing symbols rotating slowly in the air. "The Writ of Integration," Kael'thas said, and his voice filled the hall without effort, resonating through the crystal walls until it seemed to come from everywhere at once, "is extended to the species known as humanity." Alara stopped 10 paces from the throne and clasped her hands behind her back. "You are granted 90 standard cycles to complete your submission," Kael'thas continued, "during which time you will surrender all military vessels, dismantle all weapons platforms, open your genetic records for imperial cataloging, and accept the appointment of an imperial overseer to guide your cultural restructuring into alignment with the Eternal Order." He paused, and the ghost of a smile crossed his lips. "This is not a negotiation, Ambassador, and it is not a request. It is mercy, because I have studied your species, and I see potential in you, and I would prefer not to carve your name into my floor." The hall was silent, the kind of silence that presses against the eardrums, the kind of silence that 1,000 species had filled with the sound of their knees hitting stone. Alara took a slow breath. "And if we say no?" she asked. The silence changed, became something alive and electric, and in the galleries above, 100 alien diplomats stopped breathing, because no species had asked that question in the Hall of Resonance in over 3,000 years. Kael'thas tilted his head, and his smile widened just slightly. "Then your name will join the others beneath my feet," he said, "and in 1,000 years, some other ambassador, from some other small and stubborn species, will walk across the letters of your extinction without ever knowing who you were." Alara held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded once, turned on her heel, and walked back across the floor of the dead, her boots clicking against the names of the forgotten, and she did not look down, not once. She boarded her shuttle and left Valith Prime within the hour. The emergency session of the United Human Confederacy was the loudest in recorded history. 300 delegates from 14 colony worlds packed the Parliament chamber on Earth, and they screamed at each other for 6 straight hours, while protesters filled the streets outside and the news feeds burned with panic and debate and fury. Chancellor Adora Obi let them scream, because she understood that the screaming was necessary, that every voice needed to be heard before the vote that would decide whether humanity lived on its knees or died on its feet. The arguments for submission were strong and delivered by serious people with trembling hands. The Empire had 800 warships for every one of humanity's. The math was not complicated. Surrender meant survival, even if survival meant chains. And wasn't a living slave better than a dead hero? The arguments against were not logical at all, and they were delivered by people whose voices cracked with emotion, and they said things like freedom and dignity and never and over my dead body. And the delegates who wanted to submit called them reckless, and the delegates who refused to kneel called them cowards, and the chamber shook with it. Then General Idris Okonkwo took the floor. He was a tall man with a shaved head, steady hands, and eyes that had seen more war than anyone in the room. And when he spoke, the chamber went quiet, because Okonkwo never raised his voice, and that somehow made every word hit harder. "I will not lie to you," he said. "We cannot win this war, not in any way that the word winning is normally understood. Their fleet will break ours, their armies will take our worlds, and if we fight them the way wars are supposed to be fought, we will lose, and we will lose badly." He let that sink in. "But there is another option," he said, and he activated a holographic display that filled the center of the chamber with the image of a burning planet. "And I call it the Doctrine of Ashes." He explained it in simple terms, because the idea itself was simple, even if the implications were monstrous. If humanity could not hold its worlds against the Empire, then humanity would make sure the Empire gained nothing from taking them. Every colony would be rigged to burn. Every resource would be destroyed before Imperial hands could touch it. Every world the Empire conquered would be a dead world, worthless, empty, a net loss rather than a gain. "We turn ourselves into a fire," Okonkwo said, "and we make the Empire reach into that fire for everything it wants, and we burn their hands every single time until they decide that what they are reaching for is not worth the pain." The chamber was quiet for a very long time. Then Chancellor Obi called the vote. It was unanimous. Every single delegate, even the ones who had argued for submission minutes before, voted to refuse the Empire's demand. And when the tally was displayed on the screen above the chamber, 300 human beings rose to their feet in silence, because there was nothing left to say. Ambassador Ilara Mwangi transmitted humanity's reply to the Empire that evening. It was one line, sent across the vast emptiness of space to the Hall of Resonance on Valith Prime, where it was received and read aloud to the Archon Sovereign, who sat on his throne above the names of the dead, and heard 6 words that no species had spoken to the Empire in 3,000 years. Humanity does not kneel. Kael'thas read the message and set it aside, and gave the order to mobilize the subjugation fleet. 400 capital ships and 2,000 support vessels, the largest military force assembled in a century, aimed like a spear at the heart of human space. He was not angry, because anger was beneath him. He was simply going to do what the Empire had always done. He was going to teach a small species the cost of defiance, and he was going to carve their name into his floor. And the galaxy would continue to turn as it always had, in obedience and silence. That was what he believed. Harvest's End was a beautiful world, the kind of world that made colonists weep when they first stepped off the transport ships and felt real wind on their faces after months in the cold dark between stars. It had golden plains that stretched from horizon to horizon, heavy with engineered wheat that grew taller than a man, and rivers that wound through gentle hills like silver ribbons, and skies so wide and blue that children who grew up there sometimes cried the first time they saw a ceiling. 60 million people called it home. Fleet Commander Sarath Vaughn arrived with 400 warships and looked down at the planet from the bridge of his flagship and felt nothing at all, because Sarath had done this 40 times before, with 40 different species on 40 different worlds, and the routine never changed. He opened a channel and broadcast his voice to every receiver on the planet's surface. "People of Harvest's End," he said, and his tone was almost bored. "You have 6 hours to surrender your world to the Velathari Eternal Empire. Lay down your weapons and open your cities, and you will be treated with the dignity that submission earns. Resist, and you will be treated with the severity that defiance demands." He closed the channel and settled into his command chair and waited, because in his experience, colonies broke in 2 hours, sometimes less, and 6 hours was generous. On the surface, Colonel Yuki Tanaka received the transmission in her command bunker and immediately stopped listening to it. She had work to do. "Begin Operation Salted Earth," she said, and her voice was calm and steady, even though her hands were shaking under the table. "All sectors, all phases, execute now." The orders went out across the planet like a wave, and Harvest's End began to die, not from the Empire's guns, but from its own people's hands. Farmers walked into their fields for the last time, and watered and harvested for decades, fields that fed not just this colony, but 3 others. And they set fire to everything, and they stood at the edges and watched the wheat burn, and some of them screamed, and some of them prayed, and some of them just stood there in silence as the smoke rose into that wide blue sky. Engineers descended into the mines that had been carved into the hills over 30 years of back-breaking labor, and they placed charges at every support beam and every tunnel junction, and they brought the mountains down on top of the ore that the Empire wanted. Technicians poured corrosive chemicals into the water purification plants that kept 60 million people alive, turning clean water into poison. And they did it with tears running down their faces, because they understood what they were destroying, and they destroyed it anyway. Data centers that held the colony's entire digital history, birth records and love letters and children's school projects, and the accumulated knowledge of a civilization, were wiped clean. Every drive burned, every server melted to slag. And in the factories where Harvest's End built the machines that kept its people fed and warm and alive, engineers armed antimatter charges and set the timers and walked away without looking back. All of this happened in less than 4 hours. On the flagship, Sarath's intelligence officers began reporting anomalies, and their voices carried an edge of confusion that Sarath had never heard before. "Commander, the colony is not preparing to resist," one of them said. "They are destroying their own infrastructure." Sarath leaned forward in his chair. "Explain," he said. "Grain stores are burning. Water systems are being contaminated. Mining operations have been collapsed. They are dismantling everything, sir. They are taking apart their own world." Sarath stared at the tactical display and watched the heat signatures bloom across the planet's surface like flowers opening, dozens and then hundreds of fires spreading across those golden plains. And for the first time in his long career, he felt something he did not recognize. He accelerated the invasion timeline and dropped ground forces immediately. 12,000 Imperial soldiers descended on Harvest's End in armored dropships, expecting resistance at the landing zones, expecting barricades and defensive positions, and all the usual desperate gestures of a species facing conquest. What they found was a world on fire. The cities were burning, not from orbital strikes, but from charges set by the people who had built them. And the streets were empty, and the buildings were hollowed out, and every bridge was collapsed, and every road was cratered, and the air was thick with smoke and ash that settled on Imperial armor like gray snow. And in the ruins, the humans were waiting. Colonel Tanaka had moved her fighters into the tunnel networks that ran beneath every major city. Tunnels originally built for utilities and transit, now converted into a maze of ambush points and kill zones. And from these tunnels the humans struck like ghosts. Imperial patrols entered a building, and the floor exploded beneath them because every structure had been rigged with charges before it was abandoned. And the soldiers who survived the blast stumbled into the street only to be hit by sniper fire from positions that should not have existed in a ruined city. Supply convoys rolled down cratered roads and hit mines that tore their vehicles apart. And when rescue teams arrived, they found the rescue route was mined too. And when air support came in low to provide cover, shoulder-launched missiles streaked up from rubble piles that had looked empty moments before. The humans used suicide drones, small, cheap, built from spare parts in underground workshops, that flew into Imperial formations and detonated with enough force to crack armor plating. And the drones came in waves, dozens at a time, too many and too small for point defense systems designed to fight starships. And at night, the humans did something that broke the nerves of even veteran Imperial soldiers. They broadcast sounds through the empty cities, the sounds of children laughing, of music playing, of families talking and living and being alive, piped through speakers hidden in the wreckage, echoing down streets where nothing moved except ash and wind. And the Imperial soldiers sat in their camps and listened to the ghost of a world they had come to conquer. And some of them could not sleep for days. The insurgency lasted 3 weeks. Colonel Tanaka fought until her ammunition was gone, and then she fought with improvised weapons, and then she fought with her hands. And when Imperial soldiers finally breached her command bunker, they found her standing over a table covered in maps and plans, bleeding from a dozen wounds, and she looked at them and said, "You are welcome to what is left." And then she triggered the last charge and brought the ceiling down on all of them. She survived, barely, pulled from the rubble by Imperial medics who did not understand why they were saving the life of a woman who had just tried to kill them. Sarath Vaughn walked through the ruins of the colony's capital city on the 22nd day, his boots crunching on broken glass and ash, and he looked at the wasteland around him, the burned fields, the poisoned rivers, the collapsed buildings, the cratered roads, and he understood that he had won nothing. He had captured a corpse. The world was useless, its resources destroyed, its infrastructure gone, its people scattered into refugee ships or hiding in tunnels that would take months to clear. And the cost of rebuilding it would exceed the cost of conquering it 100 times over. He transmitted his report to the Archon, and for the first time in 40 campaigns he added a personal note. "They broke their own world, rather than let us have it," he wrote. "I have taken the colony, but I have gained nothing. They left us only ashes." The Archon read the report and was unmoved. He had seen defiance before in 100 forms, from 100 species, and it always ended the same way, with the defiant species carved into his floor, and the galaxy continuing its slow orbit around his throne. He ordered the fleet to advance to the next colony, and at the next colony the same thing happened. The humans burned their fields and poisoned their water, and collapsed their mines, and fought from the ruins, with a fury that seemed to grow hotter with every world they lost. And at the next colony after that, and the next, 9 worlds fell, and 9 worlds burned, and the Empire advanced through human space like a fire moving through a forest. But the forest was burning itself faster than that. Fire could spread. And behind the advancing fleet, there was nothing but silence and smoke, and the fading echo of children's laughter playing through dead cities. The Empire was winning every battle and gaining nothing from any of them. And in the dark spaces between the stars, in the refugee ships and the hidden stations, and the last unconquered worlds, humanity kept fighting, kept burning, kept refusing, and the word spread across the galaxy in whispers that grew louder with every passing day. Humanity does not kneel. Humanity does not kneel. Humanity does not kneel. 6 months into the war, and humanity was bleeding from every vein. The numbers were brutal and they did not lie. 9 of 14 colony worlds taken. 2 billion people displaced into refugee fleets that drifted through deep space like schools of wounded fish. Entire biospheres burned beyond recovery. A generation of children who had never known anything but the smell of smoke and the sound of alarms. And on every conquered world, the ashes cooled and the silence grew, and the Empire's flag flew over nothing worth having. The doctrine of ashes was working exactly as designed, and the cost was monstrous. On the colony world of Meridian, the third largest human settlement and home to one of the most advanced research facilities in known space, Dr. Lena Vasquez stood in her laboratory and stared at 20 years of her life's work. The shelves were lined with sealed containers holding samples of alien medicinal flora, plants and fungi and organisms collected from a wide array of worlds. 12 worlds, cataloged and studied and tested, each one a potential key to curing diseases that killed millions of humans every year, and some of them were the only samples in existence because the worlds they came from had been strip-mined by the Empire centuries ago. Lena's research had already produced 3 breakthrough treatments, and her team estimated they were within 5 years of a compound that could reverse neural degradation, a disease that slowly ate the minds of the elderly and for which there was currently no cure. The evacuation order had come that morning. The Imperial fleet was 12 hours out, and Operation Salted Earth was in effect, and everything had to burn. Lena's assistant, a young man named Tomas, who had been with her for 6 years, stood in the doorway and waited. "We could hide the samples," he said quietly. "Bury them somewhere the Empire might not find them. And if they do find them," Lena said, "they will use them for their own people, and none of it will ever reach a human hospital. And 20 years of our work becomes a tool of the species that is trying to erase us." Tomas said nothing, because he knew she was right. Lena opened the incinerator herself and loaded the samples 1 container at a time. And each one hissed and flared as it was consumed, and she counted them as they burned. 412 containers. 412 potential futures turned to smoke. And when it was done, she sat on the floor of her empty lab and wept with her face in her hands, while Tomas stood guard at the door and let no one in. On the occupied colony of Harvest's End, Sergeant Kofi Asante had not seen the sky in 3 months. He lived in the tunnels now, in the network of underground passages, where the remnants of the resistance hid and planned and fought and slowly went mad from the darkness and the damp and the knowledge that the world above them was a graveyard. 12 people, down from 30 when the occupation began, and they survived by raiding Imperial supply lines, darting up from the tunnels at night to ambush convoys and steal food and ammunition before vanishing back underground like rats. It was effective. The Empire was spending more resources defending its supply lines on Harvest's End than the dead colony was worth, and that was exactly the point. Every credit the Empire spent guarding ashes was a credit it could not spend elsewhere. But Kofi was tired in a way that sleep could not fix, and the question that haunted him grew louder every day. What were they fighting for? The colony was dead, the fields were ash, the cities were rubble, the rivers were poison, and even if the Empire left tomorrow, it would take a century to rebuild what had been destroyed in a single afternoon. And the people who had built it were scattered across the galaxy in refugee ships, or buried under the ruins. The question one night to his second-in-command, a woman named Priya, who had been a schoolteacher before the war, and now carried a rifle with the same calm competence she had once used to teach children mathematics. "We are not fighting for this world," Priya said. "This world is gone. We are fighting so that when some imperial officer looks at the cost report for holding this dead rock, he thinks about whether the next world is worth taking." "And if he decides it is?" Kofi asked. "Then we make that one cost more," Priya said, "and the one after that, and the one after that, until the price is too high for even an empire to pay." Kofi nodded and said nothing more, and the next night he led his team out of the tunnels and hit another convoy, and the night after that, and the night after that, because the only thing worse than fighting for ashes was letting those ashes mean nothing. In the cold dark between Mars and Jupiter, Admiral Reva Singh fought a different kind of war. She commanded what was left of the Confederate Navy, 47 ships against an armada of over 1,000. And her job was not to win battles, but to slow the Empire's advance toward Earth, buying time for the final preparations that General Okonkwo refused to discuss in detail, even on encrypted channels. Singh was brilliant. Everyone agreed on that. A tactical mind that the war colleges would study for centuries if humanity survived long enough to have war colleges. And she used every trick in the book and invented new ones when the book ran out. She hid her ships in asteroid fields and struck at Imperial flanks before vanishing into the debris, and she laid minefields in shipping lanes and forced the armada to slow down and sweep for explosives. And she sent decoy signals from empty sectors to make the Empire chase ghosts, while her real forces hit supply ships in the rear. Every engagement cost her ships she could not replace. Funerals she conducted over the comm, because there was no time to stop, no port to bring the dead home to. Took something from her that she would never get back. But she bought time, days and then weeks and then months, and the Imperial advance that should have reached Earth in 60 days was still grinding through the outer colonies 4 months later. And every day the Empire spent chasing Singh through the dark was a day that Earth still breathed. On Valeth Prime, the war was creating problems that the Archon had not anticipated. The Empire ran on conquest, always had. Each new world brought resources and labor and technology that fed the Imperial machine, and the tribute from subject species kept the economy turning and the war fleet fueled. And the system had worked for 12,000 years, because every species eventually knelt, and every conquered world eventually produced. But humanity was breaking the equation. 9 worlds taken, and not one of them was producing anything. Every colony was a dead loss. The cost of occupation exceeded the value of what had been occupied, by a factor that made imperial economists physically ill. And the subjugation fleet, the largest military deployment in a century, was burning through fuel and supplies at a rate that was beginning to strain even the Empire's vast reserves. The court noticed. Advisors who had supported the war began to ask uncomfortable questions about timelines and budgets, and provincial governors whose worlds depended on conquest-driven trade began sending carefully worded complaints. And the whispers in the corridors of power grew louder with each passing week. But the real danger was not in the court. It was in the streets and the barracks and the work camps of 100 subject worlds, where the species that had knelt generations ago heard the news from human space and felt something dangerous stir in their chests. The Inari, those tall, silent insectoids who had surrendered their wings and their songs 4,000 years ago, began circulating human resistance broadcasts through their hive networks, passing the recordings from colony to colony in ways the Imperial surveillance systems could not track. And in the deep places where Inari gathered away from Imperial eyes, they listened to the words, "Humanity does not kneel," and their folded wings trembled. The Druth, those massive scarred reptilians who had been warriors once, before the Empire broke them, and put them to work in the mines, heard the stories of humans burning their own worlds rather than surrendering them. And old Druth, who had not spoken of resistance in decades, began teaching young Druth the old war chants that the Empire had forbidden. And 4 other species, scattered across 12 systems, began having the same dangerous thought at the same time. If the humans do not kneel, why do we? Instinct of a predator that has ruled for so long that it can feel the ecosystem shifting beneath its feet. This war was no longer about one small species. It was about the idea that submission was not inevitable, that the Empire could be defied, that the names carved into the floor of the Hall of Resonance were not warnings, but battle cries. And if that idea took root, it would be more destructive than any fleet. Kael'thas made his decision. He ordered the Armada to bypass the remaining colonies and strike directly at Earth. Because if he destroyed humanity's homeworld, the beating heart of their defiance, the idea would die with it, and the galaxy would remember its place. General Okonkwo received the intelligence report on a quiet Tuesday morning, standing in his office in the underground command center beneath the Andes Mountains. And he read it twice, and then set it down and looked at the holographic display on his wall, where a small blue planet rotated slowly in the dark. Earth, the cradle, the beginning, the home. An aide entered and saw the look on his face and understood. "Sir," the aide said, "are we really prepared to do this to Earth itself?" Okonkwo was silent for a long time, watching the planet turn, watching the clouds swirl over oceans that had cradled the first life. And when he spoke, his voice was very quiet. "We are prepared to do whatever it takes to make sure no one ever kneels again." He activated the final phase of the Doctrine of Ashes. He called it Operation Last Light. And across the solar system, in hidden shipyards and secret installations and buried bunkers on every continent, the machines of humanity's last and most terrible gambit began to wake. The Imperial Armada entered the Sol system on a cold morning in March. 1,012 capital ships, plus 3,000 support vessels, arranged in a formation that stretched across 2 million kilometers of space. A wall of metal and fire so vast that when it crossed the orbit of Neptune, the gravitational sensors on Earth's moon registered a faint but measurable disturbance. Fleet Commander Sarath Vaughn stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the system unfold on his tactical display. The outer gas giants, the asteroid belt, the red dot of Mars, and there at the center, small and blue and impossibly fragile, the world that had started all of this. He had conquered 9 human colonies in 6 months, and he had gained nothing from any of them. Nothing but ash and ghosts and a weariness in his bones that had nothing to do with fatigue. And now he was here at the source, the homeworld, the place where humanity had first crawled out of the mud and looked up at the stars. The stars, and decided that it would rather burn than bow. His long-range scans showed minimal fleet presence, fewer than 50 human warships, a pitiful number, and Earth's orbital defense grid was active but outdated, designed to stop asteroids and pirates, not an armada that could crack planets. It should have been easy. Sarath had done this too many times to believe that anything involving humans would be easy. He ordered the fleet to advance at combat speed and kept every sensor at maximum range because he had learned in the burning cities of Harvest Send that humans hid their teeth until the moment they bit. Admiral Reva Singh was waiting for him at Jupiter. She had positioned her remaining 43 ships in the shadow of Ganymede, using the moon's mass to hide her fleet's energy signatures. And when the Imperial Vanguard passed within range, she struck like a blade from the dark, her ship screaming out of Ganymede's shadow in a tight wedge. Formation that punched through the Armada's left flank before the point defense systems could react. She was not trying to win. 43 ships against 1,000 was not a battle. It was a statement. But she was trying to herd the Armada, pushing it along a specific approach vector that funneled the Imperial formation through a narrow corridor between the asteroid belt and Mars. Sarath recognized the tactic. He was not a fool. But the corridor was the fastest route to Earth, and his orders were to end this war quickly, and he judged the risk acceptable. He judged wrong. As the Armada pushed past the asteroid belt, hidden weapons platforms that had been built in secret over the past 6 months activated all at once. Hundreds of railgun emplacements and missile batteries concealed inside hollowed-out asteroids, opening fire on the flanks of the Imperial formation in a storm of kinetic rounds and antimatter warheads that tore through the outer escorts like a blade through silk. Sigh through wheat, the Armada lurched inward, away from the kill zones, compressing its formation exactly the way Singh had planned, and the corridor narrowed further, and the Imperial fleet found itself funneled into a channel of fire, with the asteroid belt burning on one side and Mars on the other. Sarath lost 60 ships in 40 minutes, an unthinkable toll, and by the time his fleet cleared the asteroid belt and entered the inner system, his formation was ragged, and his officers were rattled, and the clean victory he had been promised was already soaked in blood. And then his sensors detected something on Earth that made him stop. The planet's surface was lit up with energy signatures so massive that his tactical computer initially classified them as weapons. But they were not weapons, or at least not weapons in any configuration his database recognized, because they were buried deep in the planet's crust, thousands of them, scattered across every continent and every ocean floor. A web of antimatter caches and tectonic destabilization charges wired together into a single network connected to a single trigger. It took his analysts less than a minute to understand what they were looking at. The humans had mined their own planet, not to defend it, but to destroy it, to crack the crust and poison the atmosphere, and turn the cradle of their civilization into a radioactive wasteland that nothing could live on for 10,000 years. Sarath stared at the data, and felt something cold move through his chest. General Okonkwo's face appeared on every screen on the flagship, broadcast on an open channel that the entire Armada could receive, and his voice was calm and measured, and carried the weight of a man who had already made peace with what he was about to do. "Fleet Commander," Okonkwo said, "I am speaking to you directly because I want there to be no misunderstanding. You are looking at a network of 12,000 antimatter charges embedded in the crust of the planet Earth, connected to a dead man's switch that I am currently holding in my hand. If I release this switch, or if this facility is destroyed, or if I am killed, the charges detonate and the planet dies." He paused and held up the trigger so the camera could see it, a small black device that looked absurdly simple for something that held the fate of a world. "You can have Earth," Okonkwo said, "but you will have it as a tomb." Sarath transmitted the data to the Archon on Valith Prime, and for the first time in the war, Kael'thas Ven Draethor responded personally. "He is bluffing," the Archon said. "No species destroys its own homeworld. It is unthinkable. Test his resolve, Commander. Fire on a coastal city and watch him fold." Sarath obeyed, because obedience was what the Empire ran on, and he selected a city on the western coast of the largest continent and fired a single precision strike that turned 30 square kilometers of buildings and streets and parks into a crater of molten glass. Okonkwo did not fold. He did not negotiate. He did not threaten. He did not speak at all. He simply pressed a secondary trigger and detonated a section of charges beneath the floor of the Pacific Ocean. The blast split the seabed along a fault line 800 kilometers long, and the resulting shockwave sent a wall of superheated water and debris erupting upward through the ocean surface with enough force to reach low orbit, and 3 Imperial landing ships that had been descending through the atmosphere were caught in the column and torn apart like paper in a hurricane. The ocean burned for 6 hours. Sarath watched it from orbit, and understood that this was not a bluff, that these humans had actually done it. They had actually wired their own world to die, and they would actually press the button, and there was no amount of force in the galaxy that could stop a species willing to murder its own planet rather than hand it over. And then everything changed at once. Across the Empire, on 12 different worlds in 12 different systems, the subject species rose. The Inari moved first. On their homeworld of Chisvale, millions of workers stopped working at the same moment, a coordinated silence that brought Imperial factories and mines to a halt. And when the Imperial garrison moved to force them back to their stations, the Inari unfolded their wings for the first time in 4,000 years, and the sound was like thunder rolling across the planet. The Druith moved second. On the mining world of Karath Deep, the massive reptilians turned their mining equipment on the Imperial garrison, and the tunnels that the Empire had forced them to dig became killing grounds, where Druith who had been slaves that morning became warriors by afternoon, and the old war chants echoed through the stone for the first time in centuries. 4 other species followed within hours: the Valesi, the Taun, the Crystalline Shard, and the Deep Ocean Maratai, each uprising unique in its method, but identical in its message, broadcast in every language across every frequency. If the humans do not kneel, neither do we. The Archon's court descended into chaos, advisors screaming over each other, demanding that the fleet withdraw to quell the rebellions before the Empire fractured. And Kael'thas sat on his throne and felt the ground shifting beneath him for the first time in his ancient life. He refused to withdraw. His pride, the pride of 12,000 years of unchallenged rule, would not allow it. He would break humanity first, and then he would break the others. He would remind the galaxy what happened to those who defied the eternal order. And he gave the command that he had never needed to give before. "Burn the planet," he said. "All of it. Leave nothing." The order, and read it, and sat in his command chair for a long time. He had walked through the ashes of 9 human worlds, and he had seen what was left behind. Not just rubble and ruin, but letters written by parents to children they would never see again, and toys left in the doorways of houses that their owners had burned with their own hands, and messages carved into walls that said things like, "We were here," and "Remember us," and "Do not kneel." End of sentence. He had spent 6 months fighting a species that loved its worlds fiercely enough to destroy them rather than see them enslaved. And he understood now with terrible clarity that the Empire had not come here to conquer a species. It had come here to fight an idea. And you cannot burn an idea into submission. Sereth transmitted the Archon's order to his fleet, and then he opened a private channel to every captain he trusted, and he said words that would have meant his execution on any other day. On that planet, answers to history, not to the Archon. The fleet split. 600 ships powered their weapons and prepared to carry out the order. 400 powered down and held position. And the armada that had been the Empire's unbreakable fist cracked down the middle in the space between heartbeats. In the chaos, Admiral Singh saw her opening. She gathered her remaining ships, 21 now, battered and bleeding light from a dozen hull breaches each, and aimed them at the Archon's flagship, the massive command vessel at the center of the Loyalist formation. And she accelerated to maximum burn, on a trajectory that allowed no course correction and no retreat. Her bridge crew understood, and none of them left their stations. Singh opened a channel to the flagship, and Sereth heard her voice, calm and clear. "This is Admiral Reva Singh of the United Human Confederacy," she said. "I am coming through. You may want to move. Not move in time." Singh's dreadnought hit the flagship's engine array at a significant fraction of light speed, and the collision produced a flash so bright that it was visible from Earth's surface, a new star burning for 3 seconds in the daytime sky before it faded. And when it was gone, the Archon's flagship was crippled, its engines shattered, its command structure gutted, adrift and dark. Kael'thas survived, sealed in an emergency bunker deep in the ship's core, but his voice was gone from the fleet's communications. And without that voice, the Loyalist formation wavered and broke. 600 ships that had been ready to burn a world, now leaderless and surrounded by rebellion, and uncertain of everything they had ever been told. The Battle of Sol was over, and above the wounded Earth, in the silence that followed the last explosion, the surviving ships, human and Imperial alike, drifted among the debris, and the planet below turned slowly in the light of life. Its ancient sun, scarred but alive, burned but breathing, still blue, still home, still free. 3 months after the Battle of Sol, the galaxy was a different place. And the Velathari Eternal Empire, which had stood for 12,000 years, like a mountain that everyone believed would stand forever, was cracking from the inside out. It did not fall all at once, because empires that old and that vast do not collapse like buildings. They crumble like coastlines, slowly and then suddenly, and the cracks that the war had opened spread wider every day. 11 subject species had declared independence in the weeks following the battle, their declarations broadcast on every frequency in every language, and each one ended with the same 6 words that a human ambassador had spoken in the Hall of Resonance what felt like a lifetime ago. We do not kneel. The Imperial fleet was fractured beyond repair. Sareth Vaughn's defection had split the officer corps down the middle, and entire battle groups that had served the Empire for centuries simply went home. Crews tired and disillusioned, and haunted by the memory of ash-covered worlds that they had conquered for nothing. And the ships that remained loyal to Kael'thas were too few and spread too thin to hold an empire that was pulling itself apart at the seams. Kael'thas retreated to Valeth Prime with the remnants of his court, and the Archon sovereign who had once ruled 900 star systems from a throne above the names of the dead, now ruled a single world, surrounded by advisors who whispered about negotiation and compromise and other words that had never been spoken in the Hall of Resonance before. The myth of invincibility, the Empire's true weapon, the one that had kept 1,000 species on their knees for millennia, was shattered, and no amount of ships or soldiers could put it back together, because you cannot make someone believe you are unbeatable after they have watched you lose. Humanity survived, but the word survival felt thin and inadequate for what it had cost. Earth was wounded. The Pacific detonation had scarred the ocean floor, and the resulting tidal disruptions had flooded coastal cities across 3 continents. And the atmospheric contamination from the blast would take decades of remediation to clear. And on clear nights the scar was visible from space, a dark, jagged line across the blue, like a wound that refused to close. 3 colony worlds were irradiated wastelands that would not support life again for centuries. And the other 6 conquered colonies were ruins, their infrastructure destroyed by the hands of the people who had built it. And the refugee fleets still drifted in deep space, millions of people crammed into ships that were never meant to be permanent homes, waiting for somewhere to go. The human population across all worlds had dropped by nearly 2 billion, and that number sat in the public record like a stone on the chest of everyone who read it. 2 billion lives, 2 billion names, billion stories that ended in fire and silence. The cost was monstrous, and no one pretended otherwise. But humanity endured, and in the way of humans, it began almost immediately to rebuild. On Earth, work crews descended into the flooded cities before the water had fully receded, pulling debris from the streets, and shoring up foundations, and arguing loudly about the best way to rebuild while standing knee-deep in mud, because humans had never been good at waiting for the perfect moment to start fixing things. On the colony worlds, the first returning settlers stepped out of their transport ships and looked at the devastation and wept. and then they dried their eyes and started clearing rubble, because grief and labor had always lived side by side in the human heart, and the best way a human knew to honor what was lost was to build something new in its place. Ambassador Ilara Mwangi returned to the Hall of Resonance 3 months after the battle, but she did not come alone. She came as the lead representative of the Free Species Compact, a new alliance of liberated worlds formed in the wake of the Empire's fracture, built not on submission, but on mutual respect and shared sovereignty. And its founding charter had been written by humans and Inari and Druth and Valesi together, in a room where no one knelt and no one sat above anyone else. The hall was less full now. Many of the galleries were empty, their former occupants gone home to worlds that were free for the first time in generations. But the floor was the same, still carved with the names of extinct civilizations, still a graveyard underfoot. Except that someone had laid flowers over the names, Inari blossoms, delicate and luminous, placed with the careful precision of beings who had waited 4,000 years to honor the dead properly, and Druth wildflowers, thick-stemmed and vibrant, laid down by hands that had been forced to dig mines, but now chose freely to tend gardens, and human wildflowers, dandelions and daisies and poppies, gathered from the half-burned fields of earth and carried across the stars to rest on the graves of species that no living being remembered. Ilara stood before the remaining imperial delegates and spoke in a voice that carried through the hall without the need for the crystal walls to amplify it. You carved the names of the dead into your floor to remind the living what defiance costs, she said. But you forgot what those names really are. They are not warnings, they are roll calls, and today they have company. She placed her hand over her heart and bowed her head, not in submission, but in remembrance, and behind her, the representatives of 11 free species did the same. Fleet Commander Sareth Vaughn was granted asylum by the Compact, a decision that was controversial and painful and argued about for weeks before it was finalized. He did not ask for it. To be tried as a war criminal, and part of him believed he should be because he had led the fleet that conquered 9 worlds, and he had watched those worlds burn, and he had followed his orders until the moment he stopped, and the moment he stopped did not erase the months he had not. But the Compact decided that a man who chose his conscience over his empire at the moment it mattered most had earned the right to help build what came next, and Sareth accepted the asylum with the understanding that he would spend the rest of his life carrying the weight of what he had done. He became a voice for reconciliation between the former imperial species and the new free worlds, a bridge between the old order and the new. And he never once asked for forgiveness because he did not believe he had earned it, and he was not sure he ever would. General Idris Okonkwo retired 6 weeks after the battle, stepping down from his position as Supreme Commander in a brief ceremony that he insisted be private, because he did not want speeches or medals or the word hero attached to his name. A journalist tracked him down a month later at a small house in the mountains of East Africa, where he had grown up, and she asked him how he felt about being called the savior of humanity, where it all began. And when the ship descended through the atmosphere, he looked out the window at the landscape below, and saw nothing but black earth and gray rubble stretching to every horizon. The golden fields gone, the silver rivers dry, the wide blue sky now hazy with the lingering dust of destruction. He landed in what had been the central square of the capital city, a place where children had once played, and vendors had sold fruit, and musicians had performed on warm evenings. Now a flat expanse of cracked concrete and ash. But in the center of the square, growing from a crack in the scorched earth, there was a tree. It was small and thin, and its leaves were pale, and it had no business being alive in soil that should have been dead for decades. But it was there, reaching upward with the stubborn defiance that seemed to be the only inheritance humanity had left. And someone had placed a hand-painted sign at its base. The sign read, "We grow back." Stood in front of that tree for a very long time. And he did not cry, because he had used up all his tears in the tunnels. But he put his hand on the thin trunk and felt the life pulsing inside it. And he made a promise that he did not speak out loud, because it did not need to be spoken. He would come back tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, and he would water this tree, and clear the rubble, and plant seeds in the dead soil, and do the slow, unglamorous, back-breaking work of turning ashes into something green and growing. Because that was what humans did. They burned, and they grieved, and then they grew back. Always, every time, no matter what. On a water world at the edge of explored space, far from the burned colonies and the fractured empire, and the scarred blue planet that had started everything, a Thalassian historian named Veth Morales settled into the warm currents of his deep ocean study and began to write. The Thalassians were ancient, older even, than the Empire, an aquatic species that had chosen observation over participation millennia ago, recording the rise and fall of civilizations with the patient detachment of deep-sea creatures watching storms pass far above. Veth had observed the war from beginning to end, and now he was writing the account that would be preserved in the Thalassian archives for future species to study. And he chose his words with the care of a being who understood that history was not just what happened, but how it was remembered. He wrote about the Empire and its 12,000 years of dominance, and the simple, brutal mechanism that had sustained it, kneel or die. And he wrote about the small species that had been given that choice and had found a third option that no one had anticipated. He wrote about the ashes, about worlds burned by the hands that built them, about the terrible price of refusing to kneel, about the billions lost and the centuries of rebuilding that lay ahead. And he wrote his conclusion, the passage that would be quoted more than any other in the centuries to come. The Velathari offered humanity a choice between submission and annihilation. They did not anticipate the third option. Humanity chose to burn, not as an act of despair, but as an act of promise. They turned their worlds to ash, so that from those ashes, something the Empire could never conquer might grow. The knowledge, spread to every corner of the galaxy, that kneeling is a choice, and it can be refused. He sealed the record and sent it into the archive, where it would rest alongside the histories of 10,000 civilizations, and the currents carried it down into the deep, where it would be preserved long after the last empire crumbled and the last star dimmed. On Earth, in the rebuilt Confederate Parliament building that rose from the ruins of the old one like a promise kept, workers mounted a metal plaque above the main entrance, that it faced the sky, so that anyone approaching from above, from orbit, from the stars, from wherever the next threat might come, would see it before they saw anything else. The plaque was simple, unadorned, just words on metal, and it read, "We did not win because we were strong. We won because we were willing to lose everything, and the Empire was not." Below the Parliament, in the streets of a city still half rebuilt, people walked and talked and argued and laughed, and children chased each other through construction sites. And somewhere, a musician played a song that had been written in a refugee ship during the darkest days of the war, and the melody drifted up through the scaffolding and the cranes and the half-finished buildings toward a sky that was clear and blue and wide open. And on a burned colony at the edge of human space, a small tree grew in a crack in the scorched earth, its pale leaves catching the light of a foreign sun, reaching upward. Reaching outward, reaching toward a future that had been purchased with ashes and paid for with everything humanity had. It grew back. They always grew back.